We can hear you. We can see you. We are ready to start whenever you are.
Ready to roll?
Yes, sir.
Appreciate everyone for hopping on the Zoom. Before I begin, I certainly want to thank my personnel staff. Last year, before the draft, it got a little crazy with no pro days and everything virtual. Those challenges kind of extended for the full calendar year for our staff, with limited school access and limited game access, elimination of some college games, no combine. So it was certainly a challenge to get all the information, to get all the numbers. Certainly our guys were extended throughout the country during the spring, getting every bit of information they could. Certainly proud of them, all the work they've done. And I feel like we're in a pretty good shape now. Just this morning, we finished up our final draft prep, and now we're just kind of cleaning up the bottom of the board. But we're certainly excited for next week, and with what we've done in free agency and where we are heading into this draft. Again, excited to add to this roster and make a push for a third straight Super Bowl. So with that, I'll take your questions.
Go first to Herbie Tiopi. Go ahead, Herbie.
Hey, Brett. Good afternoon. How are you doing, man?
Hey, Herbie.
Hey, you touched on some of those challenges. And I remember I asked you this last year when you had the combine, how that affected your draft board, and you had mentioned it decreased. This year, you didn't have a combine. You couldn't hold pre-draft visits. You couldn't hold private workouts at schools. How does that affect your draft board now? Is it decreasing again? And I'll have a second question after this.
Yeah, there's certainly some altercations that we had to work through, or I should say alterations. The biggest challenges are the medical, the combine. Certainly we get everything verified. And Herbie, we talked before about athletes all running on the same surface and everything kind of being uniform. This year is a little bit challenging, but feel good about where those measurements are. Some of the bigger challenges, though, are really medical related. Some of the guys, the numbers were down in regards to how many guys were able to get at the combine and get our docs hands on. There was also a number of players that got COVID and weren't able to go. So fortunately for us, Rick Burkholder and his staff do a great job of tying up those loose ends. But I would say, the biggest change for us was just how to properly assess these medicals that we didn't get our hands on. As you mentioned, the top 30 guys that we like that weren't going to get to the combine anyway. They were still a challenge. Now we had a good process for that last year. I think we had a few guys. I think Mike Dana was one that didn't go to the combine. So we had a good process based on what we utilized last year. The curveball this year, some of these higher end guys, second, third round value guys, either because of the numbers didn't work out, weren't at the combine, or because they picked up COVID and weren't at the combine. So that's the biggest challenge. I'd like to say that we have a pretty good handle on how we're going to deal with that. And we're going to place guys based on what we got and how confident we feel in that. But again, it goes back to our faith and trust in Rick. And fortunately for us, we have one of the best.
And my last question, Brett, on March the 1st, I asked you about Tyrann Mathieu, and you had mentioned that that was something that you wanted to get done, final year of his contract. Where would you say you are now? And do you have a timeline to potentially get this done before training camp?
Well, look, I mean, Tyrann's certainly a big piece of our team and what we do both now and moving forward. And I don't know if there's a timeline. Last year we were able to get a lot of our guys done. They were all during the summer. So, for us, we were really attacking the free agency, preparing for the draft. And, I can't say we've had extensive dialogue, but I'm sure that once the draft is behind us, we'll have time to address where we are as a team after the draft and moving forward. So I'm sure we'll have much more dialogue once we get into the spring and summer.
Next to Pete Sweeney. Go ahead, Pete.
Hey, Brett, thanks for doing this. You've talked in the past about these draft pockets, and now that we're within a week evaluating, your needs, your spot in the draft, positional needs, how do you feel that those pockets might play out in this particular draft?
It's always challenging picking at 31, and that's the downside of being good. Consistently that you're always picking late, and always every year it seems like, man, if we were just 4 or 5 spots higher, we'd be right in that zone where we want to be. Earlier when we got on, I guess right before free agency, thought the O-line pockets were pretty good, and thought the corner and the secondary pockets were pretty good. There's been some changes. So, once you go through that process, you get some of the numbers, and then you get some of the medical. Some is really good, but some players you have to eliminate because the medical is not as good. And some of the interviews kind of work that way too, where guys maybe get pushed up because of how they interact with our coaches and how we feel they'll be able to come in here and get up to speed quickly enough. And some guys that struggle, you got to, kind of dock them for that. But I would say, much like before the free agency process, I think that there'll be some depth in the O-line throughout the first three, 4 rounds, and the same thing with the secondary. It is a little thinner in the defensive line, in particular defensive tackle. I feel like we're pretty good there, so that's good for us. The linebacker isn't extremely deep, so again, we'll just have to be patient and disciplined and just look for value. But I think that if we just stick to our board, and that's why teams they continually update and revise and tweak that board, knowing that, where they can kind of attack it. I think that mid 2 to early 3 area is going to be a hot zone. I think that's really where there's a big fall off. I think another thing too, this draft, I know it's been said a little, online and what have you. It's unique because of the volume of prospects. I think with the college season being shortened, or some schools not having a college season at all, and with some of these, say, 50-year seniors or small school prospects having the ability to go back to school, we're finding that a lot of these players are opting to go back to school and finish their degree, potentially elevate their draft stock. So now where you kind of had some really deep pockets in 5 and 6, they're really thin now, just because a lot of players decide to go back to school and not come out. So that's a unique challenge too. So, I think that early to mid 3, 2, 3 areas is really the hot zone. There is more of a fall off this year just because the numbers are down.
Next to Adam Teicher. Go ahead, Adam.
Hey, Brett, how you doing today?
Good, Adam. How are you?
Good, thanks. We have not talked to you since free agency started, so wanted to get your thoughts on Jaron Reed, Kyle Long, Joe Thuney, and Austin Blythe, and what you liked about those guys and how you see them fitting in. And Brad, I'll have a second question as well.
Well, starting off with Joe, I mean, he was certainly a priority for us. And look, when we hit the free agency period, we certainly had a couple different plans. And I think, right off the bat, we wanted to address the offensive line. So, Thuney and Trent Williams were 2 names that made sense for us. And we were able to knock out Joe right off the bat. And speaking about Joe, he's one of the better interior offensive linemen in the National Football League. I think his ability to play either guard position and center position at a Pro Bowl level is something that was really enticing for us. The quality of person he is, his work ethic, his durability. I mean, any box that you have for an offensive lineman, we talk about intelligence, flexibility, production, intelligence. I mean, he kind of checks all those boxes off. So he was kind of a no-brainer for us. So certainly excited to add him and know that we have depth at any 3 of those positions, and know that we're going to get a quality Pro Bowl caliber player at those positions. Certainly as it was kind of thrown out there, Trent was a guy that we thought would have really helped us on that left side, and we weren't able to get that done. But right after that, it was our responsibility to be disciplined. And after Trent, we felt like we would rather, go into this draft process, and some of the alternatives out there just didn't make sense for us, whether it be a pay production combination or what we thought we can get in the draft. We just didn't want to sign someone just to sign someone. We have some players there that on our roster currently that have some ability. That in combination with the draft coming up, it was just important for us to stay disciplined, so that if other things become available, we'd be able to execute those. And you saw that with Jaron Reed. I think if you go out there and just start signing players just to sign players, then when a talent like Jaron Reed becomes available, then you don't have the ability to sign someone like him. So with Jaron, I mean, he was a guy that I think when he was coming out a couple of years ago, we had him rated as the best run defender in his draft class. And the cool thing about Jaron is over the last 2 or 3 years, he's really, developed into a quality pass rusher too. So now when we have Jaron inside and Chris inside on third downs, it's going to be extremely advantageous for us. Now we can have some flexibility with Chris and kick him out to defensive end. Certainly Derek Noddy in there can help on those base downs. So we just thought that value was so good, and Jaron was such a good player. And again, it goes back to just being disciplined, that once Trent didn't work out, just having the ability to do something like that. So we're excited about adding Jaron to our roster. And then, Austin Blythe was a guy that started a lot of games for LA, and we want to continue to always put an emphasis on depth on our roster. Now you have the ability to, depending on what you do in the draft or where we go forward at the tackle positions. I mean, certainly Thuney can play left or right guard. Having Austin allows him to do that. If we wanted to, Thuney can play center, depending on how the draft goes with our interior play. We have LDT, we have, Wiley Allegretti, Kyle Long. So we have a lot of depth now, we feel, inside, and we'll continue to add depth on the outsides. But Austin's the guy that's shown he can line up play, start at a high level. And again, having that depth with Tooney at center, now we have some position flex there. And, we were able to add Michael Burton as a fullback, certainly with Sherm retiring. Having a guy that come in and step here, play fullback and help out on teams is something we'll always, be looking for in regards to just filling out our roster, quality player there. So we're excited about what we did in free agency. We know we're not done yet and we have a lot of work to do, but it's a good start for transitioning into this draft and adding more talent.
And do you feel like there's any urgency to add an offensive lineman, particularly a tackle in the draft?
Well, there's urgency to add good players at every round. And as we learned last year, you're going to have situations where depth comes into play and obviously we have opportunities to add linemen this draft class, but just like we ran into issues up front on the offensive line, we can run into issues on the defensive line this year or at corner or at receiver. So, there's a lot of stress to always add talent and make sure that the next man up philosophy is in place and we have the talent to do that.
And Nick Jacobs. Go ahead, Nick.
Brett, I'm curious, when you're deciding between two players to where maybe on your board, this guy isn't distinctly better than the other one, what are some of the traits or characteristics you have to evaluate to make that selection?
So are you talking about repeat that question again?
Yeah. So whenever you're deciding, when it's your selection and you're deciding on a player and this guy may not, they're even keel in terms of different positions, what traits or characteristics are you having to kind of lean on to decide which guy to take?
Yeah, well, I think when you run into those scenarios where the guys value-wise looking left to right are similar, I think you'll have a natural inclination to look for need. You never want to draft for need. You want to draft the best player available. If you do get into those scenarios where the talent is equal, then you'll certainly kind of lean toward need. But just, you can never go wrong with, the makeup of guys: smart, tough, durable, guys that love the process. And it's interesting. I think when you go back and you study your drafts and how you draft and where you went wrong and what you did good. And it always comes down to football character inevitably. And it's tough because a lot of the guys that have football character questions and raise those concerns they always seem to be the most talented, and they always are very tempting. But I think if you say discipline in your approach, especially when you get into talent values that are equal, I think you always defer to the football character, the makeup, and guys that truly love the process.
Let's go next to Nate Taylor. Go ahead, Nate.
Hey, Brett, good to see you.
Hey, Nate.
In terms of, where you guys are in the first round, there's been times in the past where you've moved up. Obviously, you stayed at 32 last year. Just what is the situation that makes it advantageous for you to move up versus maybe moving down out of the first round?
Yeah, well, and that will be really predicated on your board. And we have X amount of names there that we feel are first round value and guys that can come in and step up right away. I think if we get into that zone where our cutoff might be, I think currently it's like 16 to 17 names that we feel are, impact starters, come in, play right away. I think if it makes sense for us in regards to, one of those 16, 17 players dipping into the teens or 20s to get aggressive, if those guys are gone and we're in the 20s, then that's where it becomes just more discipline and potentially looking to trade back and getting equal value and maybe acquiring picks. So it really just depends on how the board falls. And that's why we spend a lot of time just, analyzing that board and going through all these scenarios. And, like I'm sure all you guys have done, we've played out this mock draft with our staff many times. And, what if this team does this, or what if there's a trade and there's, there's a pocket there. I think that there will be potentially an opportunity that it may make sense for us. The hard part is, though, when you're picking 31, I think if you're picking at 14 or 15, that this move will definitely get you either this player or that player. At 31, it's just so far down the line, and there's so many dominoes. If one team does one thing that most people aren't expecting, it'll just kind of screw the whole dynamic of that first round. So it's really just a matter of seeing how the card's playing out and having multiple plans of attack depending on which direction it goes.
Go next to Seren Petro. Go ahead, Seren.
Brett, I'll have a quick follow-up to this. Brett, you talked about Trent Williams and taking that shot. you guys are linked maybe to some other tackles that are out there, maybe even a trade. Just overall, I mean, I know you're not going to discuss anyone in particular, any team in particular, but what is the trade market like right now, and what do you think the what's left on the free agent market at tackle?
Well, I mean, listen, there's some names that have been floating around, and we'll continue to have dialogue. And obviously, I would say that things aren't quite there yet, but there's a lot of time. I mean, between now and next Thursday, and it typically it's like that fictitious deadline. I think teams want to know exactly what they have for draft capital. So, we're getting closer to there. There's been certainly dialogue with various teams, and we have a couple things on our radar, and nothing there we're ready to move in any direction. But I mean, we're always going to continue to have dialogue with teams and make sure that we have all the information, and we can assess whether this move would be a better alternative than staying put and either moving up or moving down, and just working through that and have great dialogue with our coaches. So it's been quieter than most years, but I mean, like every year, it will always pick up, days with a few days leading before the draft. It'll certainly pick up.
All right, and then you talked about trading up or trading down, whatever it is. How much of that for fans that are watching on draft day and getting excited, and then they see a trade come down? How much of the trades are legwork you get done, say this week, and building, knowing who might want to come up, who might want to come down, versus just the phone rings, 5 minutes before you're on the board?
So that's a great question. I would say that the legwork for these deals, I presume you're talking primarily about first round deals. I mean, because obviously there's deals throughout the draft. So the legwork for most of these deals are probably done, I think, when you're picking in that top 15. Now, teams aren't going to announce it because obviously the more picks that go by, the more probable a player that you want may go. But I think that some general trades are probably agreed upon right now if player X is available. So I think that is probably very likely, again, for those top 15 teams. I think for where we're at 31, they're more of the deals that just happen. Okay, we're prepared. We have our chart values. We know the players we want. And if any of these players, as I mentioned to Nate, if they fall into that zone, we're prepared to move. Or if they're not there, we're prepared to field call and move down depending on where they pick, and the draft chart aligns. Just be prepared. It's a little bit more difficult for us because obviously the more picks that go by, the more variables and the more things change. So I would, to answer your question, I would say that most of the legwork for these top 10, top 15, I would say they're in place right now. Once you get past 15, a lot of it's more of teams. Wow, that guy's still available. All right, let's pick up the phone and let's see if we can get up there real quick. So you just have to be prepared for all those scenarios. And every year we certainly have to do a little bit more work because there's certainly more variables that come into play for us picking at 31.
We've got three more. We'll go right down the line, starting with Darren. Go ahead, Darren.
Brett, thanks again for doing this. Two quick questions. Obviously, the team is kind of top heavy with the star players that you pay with the salary, but looking at the trade market or even on the free agency, where are you all at with maybe getting a number 2 wide receiver? I know Antonio Brown has been linked to, via Bleacher Report to being a good fit for Kansas City. What do you think about him possibly coming? And then also, do you feel pressure each year to get the picks right and hope that they pay off for you?
Well, as far as the wideout position, we're excited. Having Tyreek and McCole, getting D-Rob back for us was big, and we're certainly extremely high on Byron Pringle. I think we all believe in him and the progress and the work that he's put in. We're certainly hopeful for him. We have Antonio Callaway coming in. We're excited about him, and it's just Zoom now. We'd like to get these guys in and get your hands on them, and hopefully by the end of training camp we will. But we're certainly excited about his athletic skill set and what he can do. And I think from there, I think that there's a number of different scenarios that could play out in the draft. Pete talked about pockets earlier. I think there's a mid-round pocket that we're excited about. So I don't think that we'd be in any rush to do anything on the free agency market because of where we are. We like the 4 or 5 guys that we have on our roster. That in combination with what we think will be available for us during the middle rounds of the draft, I think would be something that we'll put our priority in. Now, listen, things could change, and after the draft and once we get closer to training camp, depending on injuries and how things shake out, we'll always keep our free agency board updated and be ready to go. But I think our priority right now is to see what we can add in regards to the draft. And then certainly every pick, I mean, there's a lot of pressure. And, you know, when you do have those contracts like the star players we have, it's hard to, you know, have expensive depth level players. So you have to find those in the draft. You have to build depth. And, you know, I think we made obviously big strides last year. I think last year's draft class is going to turn out to be an excellent one. We're excited to get Lucas back in the mix here. And I think all these guys that we drafted last year are going to be ready to continue their growth and development and continue to add to our roster. So, yeah, I mean, we're looking forward to putting another class as strong as last year's and hoping that builds a good foundation for us moving forward.
Let's go next to Matt Derrick. Go ahead, Matt.
Hey, Brett, thanks for the time as always.
Mm-hmm.
This is a bit of a two-part question. The first part is you mentioned the challenges with this year's draft, and certainly one of them are players who opted out or had truncated seasons. Curious, how do you treat the players who opted out and didn't have a 2020 season? And how much do you look at the 2019 film and measuring those guys? And I'll have a follow-up to that.
Yeah. So when you ask about how you treat them, just like their decision to opt out or just the lack of tape?
The lack of tape and how that they're opting out or not having a season impacts you with being willing to bring them in.
Yeah. Well, it's tough more so for the juniors that declared, right, and opted out. Some of the seniors that decide to opt out, most of those guys I think are top line picks. There are a handful of juniors that opted out. So you're evaluating sophomore tape. So that one's, to me and to our staff, that was a little bit more challenging. I don't want to name names because some of these guys we like, but there are a couple guys that it is more of a projection just because of when you're talking about going back to 19 tape, it's sophomore tape and not junior or redshirt junior tape. So those guys are a little bit more challenging because certainly those guys get bigger, stronger, and you know, the body changes are significant from their sophomore tape to the junior tape. Whereas a guy opted out in the senior year, it's small changes, but you don't have to do as much projecting. So that's certainly been a challenge. I think, the testing helps out in some regard, just if these guys have added bulk, mass, weight, and how they move with that weight and how they carry that weight, it helps, but not as much as the tape. So a lot of it is certainly projection, but fortunately for us, there wasn't too many of those guys. And I think the guys that did opt out that were younger, I think we have a pretty good feel for. And I'm sorry, what was your second question?
Yeah, the second part is, when you are evaluating offensive linemen and particularly tackles, there's a lot of talk about the players in this year's draft, being a lot of short arm tackles.
Yeah.
How important is that to you? I mean, how important is that a factor? And is there a magic number for you as far as you want to see in that position?
Yeah, listen, it's extremely important. But at the same time, so is, their size, their athleticism, their football character. I mean, everything is important to play tackle in this league. I think teams look for tackles that are 34 plus arms. I think once you get a guy that's really good, I think you're relatively okay with 33 and change. I mean, there's a number of guards that play at a high level at those arm lengths. I think, you hate to say you have a magic number because you never want to rule someone out that's really good. And there's always exceptions to any rule. I think once you get into the 32s, it is a little bit concerning, even if the guy is extremely athletic, just because the defensive ends in this league are really athletic. And most of those guys have 34, 35-inch arms. So it's just a natural leverage game. And it's hard when an explosive defensive end with that kind of length gets inside the numbers. So again, I'd hate to say we put a number on guys because, we'll end up drafting someone with 32 and 7/8-inch arms and, I'll look like a liar here. I think in general, you'd like to be at least over 33 and anything over 34 is good, but there's always exceptions to the rules.
And we'll go last to Sam McDowell. Go ahead, Sam.
Hey, Brett.
Hey, Sam.
I had a couple things as well. I'll ask them just one at a time. As far as your philosophy for best player available, how many positions do you sort of eliminate before, obviously quarterback, I assume. And then how many positions do you go into a draft saying, I really want to address this position at some point over the 8 picks?
Well, I mean, yeah, to your point, I mean, other than quarterback, I think everything is going to be on the table. Just because, again, as we've seen last year was the O-line. The year before, I mean, we lost so many defensive ends. The year we won the Super Bowl, I think we had 3 or 4 DNs go down. So I think you can never go into the draft thinking you're good at a position, because it only takes a few weeks worth of injuries at a same position to be deficient. And that happens really quick in this league. So I think you always go on the board and you want to add quality players at every level. And as I mentioned before, once you get into more perceived positions of need, you'll certainly lean toward that way if it's close. I mean, everyone has a different grading system. So our second round would be guys that are, graded 69, 65, 60. So I think anytime you get into a situation where you're looking at, 2 or 3 players graded at that 69 level and a couple of guys at 65, it's easy to shade toward a position in need. But any discrepancy greater than that, I think you're always going to defer to your board, because, it may not make as much sense this year, but over the long haul, that contract is gonna pay off for you. So it's just a matter of being disciplined, and again, just sticking to your board. And I think anything close you can defer to need, but anything that you're more than half round separation in value, I think you always got to stay disciplined to your board. And I feel like certainly last year we stayed true to that. And what was your second question?
I just wondered, what are these last few days like? I mean, obviously, I assume that your board's pretty much set. I mean, are you just running through mock drafts, kind of?
Yeah.
Or?
Yeah, we're just going through scenarios and the what ifs, and we're looking at these players here, and we have a handful of guys, call it 6 to 8, that we think will be there. No, they all won't be there, but we feel confident that 3 or 4 would be there. And then, as the questions were raised earlier, if some of these guys that we have value as true first rounders, if they slip, where we go, if we're wiped out clean and we lose all those guys and we're sitting there on 31, we're starting to feel calls about what we would do in regards to moving up or back, where our threshold will be. So now it's really playing a lot of mock draft scenarios and just being prepared for all that. And it happens every year. There's always a scenario that you didn't think of, and there's always one player that 90% of the teams didn't have in the first round go, and that kind of makes everything go in a different direction. So I think the more dialogue and the more mock scenarios you go through, the better prepared you are. So that's always kind of where we're at this stage of the game. And look, it's a lot of fun. Like you guys are doing the same thing, and it's a lot of fun that we have to go, and we all kind of go through our own mocks. And at the end of the day, it's always fun after the draft, looking at where all of our scouts kind of, projected this draft to go and to see who was most accurate. So, but yeah, we're just going through scenarios and being prepared for Thursday night.
Brett, we really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.